I'd like to introduce you to today's presenters, Ann Mamallo and Wendy Dutton. As the Learning Solutions Architect at Microsoft, Ann manages stakeholder relationships and consults regarding the appropriate learning options for Microsoft Readiness team. Her expertise is in sales, coaching, career development, and leadership development. Ann was the 2009 president for the Lake Washington Human Resource Association and on the National Board for MBA Career Services, and has an MA in Counseling Psychology from Wheaton College and a BA in Psychology at LSU Baton Rouge. Wendy has 20 years experience in the adult learning industry, previously working at Starbucks Learning for 10 years and most recently at Microsoft Readiness. At Microsoft, she's designed and developed readiness programs for sales and marketing, such as the Compete program, focused on how to compete against top competitors. And she has spent the past 2 years managing the Pitch Perfect program, which is what we will be talking about today. So with that, Ann and Wendy, I will turn the presentation over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Kayla. Can you hear me all right?
Yep, you sound great.
Thank you. So thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here to talk about the Pitch Perfect Coaching and Certification Program. It's a program I'm very proud of, and that has created a lot of business impact and measurable learnings at Microsoft, so very proud to be here to share some of those best practices with all of you. So some of the things that we're going to cover off today on this webinar is, first we're going to talk about what were the business drivers and, the business needs that created us to build this program in the first place. And then what is the solution, what is this coaching and certification program that we've created? What are some of the business outcomes and some of the measurable business impacts that we've been able to achieve? And then, of course, what are our lessons learned? What are some of the critical things that we've learned to be able to make this a successful program? And then hopefully lots of good time in the end to open it up for Q&A. So let's start with the business need. And so what really drove the creation of this program was we wanted to find a learning program that really shifted and adapted and scaled in terms of the shifting products and services. A company like Microsoft, there's always huge shifts in what do we sell and what are our services, who are our customers, and what are the skills needed for our sellers to be able to adapt to all of these changes in the industry. And so we have over 40,000 sellers in our target audience, so we knew we needed to create a program that was very flexible and scalable, but reachable to all of these sellers. Another thing that we know we wanted to achieve is we wanted to leverage the whole idea of using a coaching culture to be the main methodology and modality to reach our sellers and to use coaches to be those experts in the field who are giving our sellers the coaching they need to demonstrate proficiency. We also needed, knew we wanted a consistent measurement and a consistent bar where we knew that the majority, if not all of our sellers were passing this consistent criteria to ensure that they are ready, they've demonstrated proficiency, and that we can measure that impact. And like I said, also business impact. That was one of our #1 goals, is that we were really implementing a learning program that was measurable, that we knew we were driving real, tangible results, and we'll get more into that later. And so before we dig in, we thought it would be interesting to do a quick poll on, just to my earlier point about so many different things that drive the need to develop learning programs such as this. So we thought we'd do a quick poll on this and have you identify some of these areas that you're dealing with your customers. So Kayla, I'll let you take control of this.
Yep, so everyone should see the poll available on the right-hand side, so go ahead and input those answers. Looks like we've got about 30 seconds left, and then we'll go ahead and close it out and share the results.
To add a little context to what additional thought, this is Ann speaking. You know, Microsoft really, in technology, nothing ever stands still. And so how do you turn an entire workforce to start selling and doing things differently? And that was the task in hand, and Wendy was looking at a pretty daunting challenge of how do we create this program? It has to reach everybody, it has to teach new behaviors. It was a pretty daunting task ahead, and that's really what she was looking at as we were designing the program. So I think in industry today, so much changes so quickly that it's to have something that you can use is really helpful. Kayla,
yeah,
how's it coming?
Absolutely. I mean, it was. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, just checking on the polling, how it's going.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and share the results.
Great. Interesting. Yes, new processes. I see 51%. That's a big one. That's a big one that also impacted this as well. It's interesting to see coaching culture is 40%, and of course, always new skills required. But yeah, definitely an interesting mix.
Thank you, everybody, for participating. I think those trends are fairly accurate, and we all know how excited people are for new processes. So let's turn a little bit to the solution and how we approach this. And so we worked sort of hand in hand with Wendy and her team. There was a pretty large virtual team working on it, and they were all working overtime on it. And we started with design principles. We were like, okay, if this is going to be as successful as we need it to be, it was one of the big bets of the company, of the group, what do we need to do? And we really went with these principles, and these were our guiding lights, and we kept going back to them whenever we had questions, and we had many, many, many decisions that had to be made. And just a note, Microsoft calls its salespeople sellers, so you'll hear that language regularly. So the first thing we started with is we wanted to design first and foremost that the person getting coached was the person we were focusing on. So we needed to understand them, we needed to understand their constraints, we needed to understand their attitudes going in, any fears or trepidation they would have. That was really first our design start point. Then we backed up and we thought, well, we need the coaches to be very successful because they won't want to do it if they're not successful. So we designed with that in mind. Then we went to Microsoft and said, what does corporate need? So Wendy referred to creating a bar or creating a sense of everybody being ready. Microsoft needed to know that the sellers were ready. So we thought, how do we build that in? Then we thought we need it to be safe. If it's not safe, Microsoft can be a hard driving environment, highly metric driven. And so if it's not safe, if sellers feel like this is going to be used against them, they just won't do it. It needed to be real because people are too busy to do things that aren't real. It needed to have prestige because at the very beginning, we've done this for almost 2 years, the very beginning it was voluntary. And if it was just sort of a one thing, sign up, nobody notices, we didn't think anybody would come. We needed to make sure everybody knew what success looked like. We wanted it to make sure that it integrated with other things people were doing in their day-to-day, so it didn't feel like an add-on or extra. It felt like part of their regular work. And finally, we wanted them to learn about very specific targeted business outcomes. So there were key products and services that were being focused on, those key conversations, so we aligned them to those. And these, we made decisions probably every single day when in the very beginning of this program, and these were our touchstones in the way where we went back to. So what was the end result? We said we started with seller. This is what the sellers experienced. They would, a coaching session would be, they would think, oh, I need to learn X product. So they would watch an online training. They would register for a coaching session. They would prepare for that coaching session, and because everybody brought in their own, you know, they prepared an actual sales call. They were not doing this as a hypothetical. They were saying, okay, I want to meet with the VP of Marketing. This is this person's name. This is the person's profile. This is the company background. So they did pretty rigorous preparation. Then they would go into the coaching session. These were hour-long. Initially, we designed it so that there were 2 coaches in each session, and we did that at the beginning especially because we wanted to give the coaches a chance. One could be the customer and one could be an observer or a coach. And so they would sign up for this coaching session. They would practice their role play. They'd say, here's who it is. They would actually do their role play, which nobody likes to do, by the way. Nobody signs up and says, I love role plays. They actually always hate them, and they're always incredibly grateful afterwards. After that, they'd deconstruct. They'd go through and they'd say, here's what went really, really well. What did you think? They'd give feedback, very constructive feedback, and coaching on those things. And then they would use a coaching conversation checklist, which Wendy's going to talk about shortly, to evaluate how they were doing against what the expected behaviors were. And that was a coaching session. So for a seller, they would do some preparation and go into this coaching session and walk out having prepared for a real conversation they were ideally having in the next week or 2. So Wendy, why don't you talk about the conversation checklist of it?
Great, thank you, Ann. So I would say out of all of the components and all of the assets that we created for the coaching and certification program, that this asset is probably the most critical, because what you're really doing is boiling down the customer conversations and those critical conversations that we were trying to achieve to 10 critical behaviors. And I think we spent the most time on this because this is really where the rubber meets the road, and where our sellers are, really, we know that they need to nail these behaviors in order to land that conversation and be successful in that specific scenario. And so this was a very important component, because if you don't get this right, then everything else doesn't fall into place. And so the biggest thing is just making sure you have all of the right subject matter experts and stakeholders. And what we did is we just made sure we used something called the Delphi model, which is where we're basically boiling it down from across all of our stakeholders and SMEs through a series of tests and iterations to make sure you're really boiling down that assessment criteria to the key behaviors, and also the simplicity of it. I would never recommend going over 10 behaviors. You want to keep it somewhat manageable and consistent so that you can, simplify it and it can be repeatable. So the building of this conversation checklist, I think, was probably one of the most critical components. So let's move into the next piece, which is the pitch planner. So that was the conversation checklist that the coaches used to assess the coaching conversation. So this was another critical piece, and this is all around the preparation. And so one thing that Ann talked about was the reason why this, out of, I think one of the most critical reasons why this program is successful is that it's not a canned scenario. It's not a make-believe situation. It's a real account that a seller will be focusing on. So what they needed to do is pre-work, where we guided them across those 10 behaviors, and they had to fill out this pitch planner. And I would say they spent at least a couple of hours in preparation for this conversation. And so, like, who is their business decision maker? What are the business challenges that you are focusing on? What is the industry? What are the customer business drivers? And so this not only prepared the seller for their coaching conversation, but this also was sent to the coaches so that the coaches can do their homework, and they put just as much homework into each of these conversations because they're role-playing that customer. They're raising objections. They're raising common difficulties in that conversation. They're making it as real as possible. And so the point I'm trying to make here is that this is pre-work based on a real situation, and then the rigor behind it, I think, is also important to make sure that the seller spent the right amount of time and guided the right amount of preparation to land that conversation. And this is just another section of the pitch planner to show how we sort of guided them to start preparing for the conversation. So one of the biggest readiness gaps our sellers faced, which was a driver behind this program, is they really needed to learn how to adapt from these product type conversations and really make that mind shift in how you're talking about our solution story and aligning it to the challenges of the customer. And so all of this preparation tool, this pitch planner, was really their pre-work and homework to make sure that they knew how to prepare and pull the critical components they needed to land that customer conversation. And so those two components, the pitch planner, which we call the pre-work, and the conversation checklist, I would say are the two critical pieces of content that we really needed to get right to make sure that the coaching sessions were successful.
Thanks, Wendy. And I think it really, we've had many iterations of this program since, so different groups using it, different areas, and those two pieces have stayed consistent. They were vetted so carefully and worked on so diligently to make sure it reflected the desired behaviors that we wanted to see, that those have been pretty much untouched and really have stood against virtually all groups. So I think that doing our homework there made a lot of difference. Absolutely. So let's talk about, we're going to move on and talk about what we did for the coaches. So that was the sellers, so you got a picture of what the sellers did. This is what we did for coaches. So these are the actual modules for the coaching program. And you can see through this, we used the branding that we did for the program. We used that in this presentation. And that was an important piece. It needed to feel, it needed to have a certain look and feel, and we were able to achieve that through some of these things like these quotes from coaches, some of the visuals. That was part of the sort of prestige factor. So here's what we did in the coaching class. We started with a kickoff, and almost always, so on the first year, we did almost all live sessions, and we did them across the globe. And our first one was at the big sales conference in July for Microsoft. And so we have a course kickoff, and we usually try to get somebody who's a leader or an executive to do that and talk about the importance of practice, those kinds of things. And then we'd move into the endorsement experience, and that's what we're calling this. It's a coaching session or endorsement experience. And when the designer, Karen Bailey was a designer of this, and when she was thinking about this, she said, you know, if we can give everybody a picture at the very beginning of what this looks like, we will save a lot of time. Because otherwise, we're going to be teaching these modules, and people will all have different pictures in their head. We want everyone to have the exact same picture in their head when they go through this training. And so that's what we did. We did videos to show what this would look like and what they should be doing. And that really cut some time. Year 2, we moved into a virtual delivery. So we do a virtual instructor-led class, 2.5 hours, and we put this section into the pre-work. So when people go into that class, they already have a picture of what they'll be doing, and it saves a lot of time and it saves a lot of level setting. So that's it. Then Be a Challenger is something we added this year. It's a sales methodology that CEB designed, and so we wanted to make sure that coaches knew about that and knew what to look for. Then Module 4 is one of the key components. It's how to be a customer. And initially people think, oh, you know, how hard can this be? I talk to customers all the time. This should be easy. But there were a couple of things that we wanted to make sure they knew. One is we wanted sellers to try new customers. We didn't want them to just talk to IT. We wanted them to talk to marketing and operations and sales and all those kinds of areas. And so we had them think about if you're a COO, what do you care about? What impact does it have? And in having coaches do that exercise, they realize that they don't always know what that particular role cares about. And so that was really important. It was an aha for the coaches. And then we have them prepare to be a coach, and they do a role play, one customer, one coach, and one observer. But the observer, instead of observing the seller, the observer's watching the customer and making sure that the customer is being convincing. Because if the customer isn't staying in role, if the customer is being too hard and too rigorous and just sort of objecting to everything, the seller doesn't really have a chance. If the customer is giving them too much information too easily, essentially being a laydown, that's not helpful either. So we needed to train, how do you be not too hard and not too soft and stay in role? And that was more of a stretch than people thought. Module 5 was to give feedback and coach, and so we had a methodology around the coaching. And then also, how do you go through this conversation checklist? There's these 10 behaviors. You're basically saying you observe them or don't observe them. What do you focus on? How do you focus? How do you give enough information to be helpful, but not too much to overwhelm people? And so we had them practice that. And then finally was the wrap-up of coach support. How do you actually do the program? How do you sign up for appointments? How do you do all that kind of thing? So this was the day, and it also was compressed into a 2.5-hour VILT. The first year we had hard copy materials. It's just one of the pieces that we used. The second year, because we were doing virtual, we put everything into a Microsoft OneNote, which is a Microsoft product, and it turned out to be a very, very successful way to deliver the material. It cut costs down. You could revise the materials easily. It was really an effective way to be able to adjust them and not have the delay or the short, if you have to ship something, it really helped on that too. So we talked about many of these things, so let me just make sure we've covered it. We already talked about rigorous preparation through the pitch planner. We talked about why we use 2 peers as coaches. That was to give folks a chance to practice before they had to do it one-on-one. It was interesting to see this too, because for some coaches, they loved working with their cohort. They like made buddies. And they did every single session. They were all asked to coach 10 people. That was the requirement. And they did all of them with a buddy. And that was something that they found actually really reinforcing and interesting and helpful. Others would go straight to the one-on-one. So we didn't care which one they did. We just wanted to provide the support. The concierge is a background piece of a scheduling service. So we wanted to take away all the barriers to scheduling, which is actually half the time the hardest part. So we provided scheduling support, and they felt that made them feel very, very special, as indeed they were. We talked about a purposeful launch and how we did pretty extensive communication planning, all those kinds of things. And I think we talked about these as well.
Yep, I think that too, just to reiterate the concierge, I would say this program wouldn't have been successful if you just completely automated it out of the gate. It needed to have that white glove port, and then also having, that those people to ask any questions that coaches or sellers had. They fielded questions through our Pitch Perfect inbox. So I think that was a critical component to the success of the program for sure. So let's talk about the outcomes. So I'm very proud of the outcomes of the Pitch Perfect program so far. We had a really tall order at the beginning of last year to create this program, a lot of things we were trying to achieve. And I feel like the reason why it has been so successful is that we sort of hit the nail on the head. We hit the behaviors that our sellers were really struggling with, what they really needed to understand. So it's almost like if you build it, they will come, dynamic sort of happened. And so some of the things that we've kind of come out with is we have created quite a cultural shift in coaching, which is what we wanted to do. We have over almost 75% of all of our sales managers in sales have been trained as Pitch Perfect coaches. We have a goal to have 100% of our sales managers trained by the end of the year. We have a goal, not just a goal, a commitment that's been set down from our CEO down, that all sellers will be Pitch Perfect certified by the end of the year. And then measuring business impact, because we've been able to align these coaching sessions to real scenarios, we're able to start to measure actual revenue results. Looking at the accounts that our sellers have brought into these coaching sessions and using a focus group, or not a focus group, a control group, being able to sort of identify that we've had shifts in deal velocity and win rates that have started to climb due to these coaching sessions. So real measurable business impact. And then some of the highest quality satisfaction results we've had. We measure everything at Microsoft. We call it our NSAT results. And the sellers have rated this program higher than most of any of our other learning assets that we have. So the outcomes have been amazing. And again, I think it's because we have sellers coaching sellers. I think that's one of the success factors, is that we really have the field teaching the field and coaching the field, and they're learning from each other, and they're sharing best practices and sharing, their experiences with each other. I think that's probably the biggest thing I'm proud of from this program. And then, the ability to measure real impact, to know that we're actually really helping sellers move that needle and land their deals. So those are some of the major outcomes of the program. So what I thought would be really cool to share is we have many testimonials that we've been able to gather from sellers, lots of, testimonials from our leadership team that this is exactly what the field needed. But I think that this is a really powerful one. So let's watch one of our sellers talk about what they learned. I think that one of the things that he makes me think about too is we were up against some serious skeptics. Like, our sellers have very little time. They want to get in, get out when it comes to learning, and they were very skeptical. But what we realized through these testimonials is one seller, said it best to me, is like, nobody, whether it's in sports or sales or any career, nobody is ever good at anything unless they practice. And this gives our sellers a safe environment to practice. And so that's sort of a consistent piece of feedback that we get from our sellers, that what they like about the program. Let's move to the next slide.
So go ahead.
Ann. Oh, yeah.
I wanted to say, so Wendy was up against some pretty big odds, because initially the mandate was we were going to train 50 coaches and have 500 sellers go through the program. And almost immediately that number quadrupled. And so she had to very, very, very quickly scale this program way beyond expectations. And even now it keeps on growing and growing and growing. And it looks like from the chat some folks weren't able to hear the video. I'm sorry about that. Streaming is always a little bit dicey, so we can figure out what to do about that. So when we thought about this and we thought about how do we, you know, what are the lessons learned? So you probably aren't from a company. You may not be from Microsoft. You probably aren't from Microsoft. You may be from a smaller company. You may be doing things differently. So what can you take away? So what if you're not going to do it on this scale, what can you actually do, or what would we do again regardless of where we went? And that's how we approach this piece. And these are the pieces I felt like, or we felt, were really important. And one is know your audience. I cannot express knowing what the seller constraints were, knowing what the coach constraints were, knowing that there was reticence. That was so important because it made the design spot on. And that's what really made it work. And then Wendy did talk about that you can build it and they'll come. But we actually found the first year, before it had gotten famous, you know, before there was kind of a buzz around it, we built this great program. The coaches were all ready. It went beautifully. And then the sellers hadn't quite gotten on board. So if I were to go back in time, I would have built that stream at the same time, realizing that you kind of have to have everybody come together at the same time. And there was a bit of a lag. So I would have added that. At this stage, there's huge demand. So that part has worked it out. The other couple things, you know, the prestige, I think it made a lot of difference that we chose the brightest and the best to be the first coaches. I think if we'd gone straight to managers, because now all managers are coaches, I think it would have made it more a task that managers had to do. In this case, we made it a way that high performers could really show up as an elite person, and it was really something that I think was important. The advocates, I think that's always important. Who's going to sell it? It totally mentioned it. It totally made a difference of who was getting the messages out. In one case, we had one group. The program kind of took on a life of its own. We had a couple of coaches that were very fired up, and at one of their regional meetings, they said, hey, look what you can do, and they built themselves an app, and they had people sign up real time. The sellers responded to that because they were sort of high esteemed peers. They responded to their general managers, so it really mattered who we had giving that message. And then the last one I would speak to is making sure that it's tied to something that is very important to the business. So this was something that Microsoft had to do. It had to make a pivot, and so it was worth the time and the energy and all the thought and all the decisions and all the investment of intention. It was worth that because it made a difference to the business. I don't think if it hadn't been tied to a critical business goal, I don't know that we would have kept as much steam, and I think that made a difference. Wendy, do you want to cover the last three?
Yeah, I would agree with you that the big ones, I'll actually just stress some of the big ones that you already said. I think the last one there for me is the most important, and it's to create a safe environment. I don't think this program would have been successful if it was something sort of pushed on our coaches. It was being done by their direct manager, that it was seen as a safe environment. You heard Peter say that he was very cautious and skeptical, but when he realized it was a safe environment where he's getting authentic coaching and it's an opportunity for him to practice and get better, I think that probably is the most important lesson that we learned that was a critical success factor. And then again, just to reiterate what you said is foster the coaches by making sure our coaches, were recognized and realized how they were impacting the business. We did a lot of, recognition by our, senior leadership team of our top coaches and things like that. I think fostering our coaches, making sure that they're getting the support they need was probably also one of the biggest lessons learned and critical success factors. Those were the big ones for me, for sure.
Yeah, and I for number 7, there were a couple surprises that I had, and one was that the coaches really wanted to know how they were doing. So they got evaluated by their coachee, and they got that feedback, and they were hungry for that feedback. So that was a gift to them, and that was a surprise. And the other surprise that I had, and it wasn't in the design exactly, but I taught the course to a bunch of sellers down in the Bay Area not too long ago. And one of the guys came up afterwards and he says, you know, I've been in this business for 30 years. I've been a manager for many, many years. I've been through so many coaching programs, but this one is one of the best I've ever seen. And he said, because really, generally, you go through a coaching program and you're told, you kind of have an action plan and you're supposed to go do something, but there's no follow-up. He said, in this one, I have to go out and coach 10 people, and I'm going to get feedback on how I coach those folks. That makes me, I'm going to practice this next week. And I thought, wow, you know, I didn't really, it was kind of baked into the program, but I hadn't really thought about it. But it really did ensure that they were learning it and practicing it almost overnight. And that was really important. So I think those are the other lessons learned.
Absolutely. And one other thing I would add before we close or go to questions is creating a coach community. So we created an internal Yammer group where coaches can share best practices, share, you know, insights that they've provided in their coaching sessions so other coaches can learn. I mean, like we said earlier, all the different shifts and products and processes and services, all the different, you know, insights. Creating a coaching community, like something like a Yammer group, I thought was extremely critical to make sure that we're always, you know, sort of cross-pollinating and sharing back the insights.
Thanks,
Those
Wendy.
are good ones for me.
Sorry. These are just some of the images we used. Again, that was part of the branding piece. And I think we're ready for Q&A. Kayla, are there any questions that are popping up?
Yeah, there's a lot of great questions coming in. So first of all, thanks, Ann and Wendy, for that great presentation. So just as a reminder, if you do have a question for either of our presenters, go ahead and enter it into the Q&A module at this time. And just as a reminder, they covered a lot in 45 minutes, and we still have more information to discuss, but we encourage you to continue the conversation with Ann and Wendy, and we'll have their contact information available in the slide deck. And we will also be sending a link to a follow-up blog post where we will address some of the key takeaways from today. And then also, finally, I'd like to remind everyone that the recording and slides from today will be sent to the email address you provided within 48 hours. And so with that, we will get to these questions that are coming in. So the first one is referring back to the outcomes slide. How are you measuring the cultural shift in coaching?
So that's a really good question, and you can chime in. But I mean, I think one of the big shifts is just really measuring how many sales managers are committed to signing up as Pitch Perfect coaches. So this was one thing that was not required at the beginning. You know, before, our sales managers were really not you know, really not on the hook at all to coach around our priority conversations or around our critical business deals. And so the fact that we were able to, you know, onboard 75% of our managers to take on this commitment and to ensure they coach a minimum of 10 sellers throughout the fiscal year was a huge shift just by the pure volume of being able to get them on board was one big measurement. And then also the surveys and focus groups we use to make sure that the quality of the sessions are meeting our bar. So we measure, obviously, the quality from the focus groups that we measure with our sellers. I hope that answers your questions. Ann, did you have anything to add on that one?
I'd agree. That one was not culture is a hard thing to measure. We didn't have a hard and fast measurement, but adoption is really how we measured. Okay, there are a bunch of other questions. I'm seeing some of them. A couple questions about the coaching model. We used a proprietary model initially. I think you could use whatever, and we'd encourage you to use whatever model you would use that you're using consistently in the company. But we had a proprietary model we were using. I've got was it a global effort? It was. We ran sessions across the globe. The entire globe is responsible, and each region has its own sort of landing plan. Do you want to speak to that, Wendy?
Yeah, it is, and that was definitely one of the most daunting pieces is, you know, we have 40,000 sellers across the globe. And the way that we break our sellers out is by subsidiaries. We have 15 subsidiaries. So we ensured, you know, just the fact that sales managers across all of our sales teams were who we focused on to be the coaches. We did have global coverage that way. But we ensured that we focused, you know, first on our coach capacity and getting all of our sales managers trained and having coverage across our subsidiaries. And then when we sort of had that global coverage in our coach capacity is when we then really started to open up our coaching sessions. You know, we implemented, like we talked about, our concierge service, which is a, you know, 24-hour SLA, you know, team of people across our time zones. We have about 10 concierge support people that, you know, take in these requests from sellers across the different time zones and match them up with coaches in their particular country and region. So that's sort of how we scaled it across the 15 subsidiaries.
And they did, you know, each region's a little bit different. Japan wanted to have live sessions, so we ran live sessions in Japan. And the selling style is a little different for those regions, too. So we wanted to make sure that we had bilingual and bicultural folks teaching that and coaching to those. And that made a difference. I think we have time for a couple more questions. How did we determine what skills the sellers needed in order to begin building the program? Wendy, do you want to take that one? How did we come up with a conversation checklist?
Yeah, I mean, and also it's kind of this, the way that we aligned it to making sure that they're coaching around these specific customer conversations. It's almost this delicate mix of the what and the how. You know, we knew that they needed to have assets to make sure that they were able to, you know, coach around these solution areas. You know, like some of the solution areas that we focused on were how to have an Azure, our Azure conversation, which is one of our top, you know, competitive areas. So focusing on the what, but I think the most important was the how, the skills. You know, these are sales managers. You know, there's a certain level of competencies that we assume they have around coaching in general, but it's how to be a good pitch perfect coach, how to ensure you're giving really clear feedback across those behaviors, that you're, you know, raising the right objections and you're providing the right amount of feedback that they need, really with the sole purpose of helping that seller land that conversation and be successful in that scenario.
Yeah, and it came, you know, it came from some a sales model that Microsoft had in place. So it came from, it's called they talk about the 4 pillars. These are the 4 pillars of a good sales call and a good sales methodology. So we first started with distilling out from that and what were the things that and as we did interviews, we also interviewed and listened to what do sellers tend to do poorly and what do they do well. So in one case, and this is very typical of technical people, they tended to talk about features and products instead of really understanding the business needs. So we knew that that was one of the behaviors we needed to measure. They tended to speak more than ask, so we knew we needed to measure that. So we kind of went at it from a business model, sort of the sales model that we had. We thought about what a sales call would look like what's in a good sales call, and then we found out what sellers were not doing very well that we needed to make sure that we're covered. That's how we. Yeah,
that's a good point, Ann, is making sure that we align it to our existing sales methodology and what are the key pillars to having a successful sales conversation, you know, aligning it to business priorities, listening to your customer, understanding the business drivers, and then aligning your solution story to that. So that's a good point.
I think we're at time. Kayla, where are we on time?
Yeah, we're right at the end of our session. We can go ahead. We have one more, actually two more that I'll wrap into one question just so we get these all answered, and then we can go ahead and wrap it up. But finally, how did you guys pick the coaches, and who was involved in defining the behaviors and the checklists, as well as some detail about how did you certify the coaches?
So the checklist, like I said, is like the most critical piece, because the checklist is really what's that bar that we call, quote unquote, certifying. The way that we measure it is if they demonstrate 8 of the 10 behaviors, we call them certified. If they don't, we didn't go with any sort of a pass-fail scenario because we wanted this to be a safe environment, but we offered them to come back and, re-practice and nail those other 2 behaviors that they might not have done so well on. So we really sort of took a soft approach to that whole certification piece. And the way that we did it, like I said, is we made sure that we went to the field. We went to our top sellers, our high performers, and we tried to figure out what are these key behaviors to having a successful conversation, and then just kept socializing it and boiling it down to those 10 behaviors. The 10 behaviors are really just the most critical piece to all of it.
And for the coaches, if they went through the class, that was their certification. We tried to make that barrier pretty low, but the course was, they were doing quite a bit of practice in the course and that kind of thing.
Great. Well, thanks again to both of you guys for presenting today. This was a great session, and thanks to everyone who was on the call and for your time and attention for attending today and all of your great questions. If you have any more questions, their contact info is up on the screen right now, and we'll be emailing a copy of the recording and the slide deck to everyone here shortly. And we hope that you'll join us again for our next webinar on MOOCs Mania. That one will be on January 8th. And this will actually be the first of 4 sessions in January that we'll be focusing on learning trends for 2015. So with that, for GP Strategies, I'm Kayla Rotz. I wish everyone a great rest of your day, and thank you again for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.